frozen piece of meat or a frozen.
Yeah, that's true.
Because there's literally just like frozen entrees, frozen vegetables, frozen and Cub or Target.
Kind of in a different section maybe too. Like I feel like frozen foods are like in an aisle in Cub Foods or whatever, but it seemed to me like the frozen that they had was like in the back of the store, so it's like probably harder to find.
Tomato pasta type things, the Italian sorts of stuff. I was going to say if they don't have frozen foods, how do they preserve the food? What other ways did they have of transporting and preserving food?
Dried a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of those peppers, chilies were dry.
Okay.
Canned.
Canned.
Brine.
Mm-hmm.
Banana peppers in a can with in like a not a broth but a liquid,
Mm-hmm.
or olives or peppers.
And it might be hard to believe, but 50 years ago, as I said before, that about half of the typical grocery store was canned stuff, canned or bottled. But as through the 60s, people bought freezers and more frozen foods, and as they figured out how to flash freeze stuff like vegetables, and then as they started, frozen pizzas and TV dinners. But things like, frozen lasagna or the frozen entrees like we have them today, that probably didn't come along until about the 70s, would you say? Well, something like
Just until college, my mom never let us eat TV dinners. Which I probably shouldn't complain about in all home cooked.
Yeah, you poor kid.
Well, there's an old, about a 1964-65 Rolling Stone song that makes fun of the housewives of the day because they making their husbands a packaged cake and frying a frozen steak, and I mean that sounds pretty good to me today, but that's anyway. Did you learn anything about any of those cultures by what you saw there?
Seemed like the Asian store was much more seafood based.
Okay. Well, as you enter into learning a culture, frequenting their stores, and because you go to one Hmong store, that doesn't mean that you're getting all of the Hmong culture. Or you go to one Latino store, because there oftentimes if one store has A, B, C, the next store may have B, D, E, and there may be some overlap, but a lot of time you'll have times in the same neighborhood you'll have a couple stores, and this one will have specialties in this and in this, and this one will have specialties in this and this. It's like in Latin America, if you need to buy hardware, all of the hardware is in one neighborhood. It's the hardware neighborhood. If you need to buy car parts, they're all in one neighborhood. There isn't a car parts store on the other side of town. There isn't, they're all there. But this hardware store has this stuff, and this hardware store has this stuff. And so if you go that area, you have all these small shops, and they all have their specialty, and they'll all say, oh no, you need to go over to Pedro's over here and get that because he's got that. And this way they don't step on each other's toes, and if you need to get something, you're more likely to find it because you've got kind of a unintended department store of all of the different specialties of that area.
One of the things, like when in the Philippines, you also develop relationship with the store owners. So you have what they call a suki. It's a person you go to, you've been doing business with, and you always go to him there's other auto parts stores, but you go to this one that you've been dealing with already before, so you have that relationship, and they give you usually a better price
Okay.
than if you go to some other one. I mean, that's my experience with some of that.
By the way, today, when I stopped in at the noodle factory, noodle store, I said, "No, what is your background?" She said, "Well, I'm Chinese, but the store way back was created by Filipino Chinese. So you have Chinese that are all over the globe."
Yep.
And so, all right. Why don't you keep all of Patty Lane 7 through 9 in your heads till next week, and we'll do the quiz then, so we can get on with the story of Minneapolis. Is that okay? Did you get it to work? That's why it's making noise. What was the matter? Okay, is the remote at hand there someplace, or do I have it already? Did I pocket it?
We develop that relationship with them. They expect you to come to them first, when you've got that relationship already.
Is it not working?
And they, with the haircut, of course, they get to know, you get to know that your hair a certain way.
Nuts. Well, I guess I get to stand the rest of the night. Okay. So let's talk about the Twin Cities. Now, okay, better start recording because the people are going to want to watch this. I grew up with a dad who was always curious, and he loved history, and he started to teach me about the Twin Cities, the stuff that he knew back when I was a tiny guy. I grew up in Little Canada, which is a very historic area, one of the earliest settlement areas, and French Canadians came down. We'll talk a little bit about them. And I grew up with kids who were descendants of those French Canadian families. I'm supposed to have this under, aren't I? Ba-dump. Okay, so let's talk about the Phillips neighborhood. Now I'm saying it's 1805. Now I could have said 1680. I picked 1805 because really that's the beginning of permanent European settlement, and we'll talk about that. So, which way is that baseball going?
Towards you.
Okay, towards you. What do you guys think?
Technically, you can't tell.
How many think it's moving? Okay. Well, with gravity being what it is going down, we know that much. But we really keep, from a snapshot, one point in history, thousandth of a second maybe, we can't really tell the direction of where things are going. When we're doing ministry, we're always trying to figure out which way are things going. Because you're building ministry, you're creating ministry, you're working with people, and you're not building something for the way they are today. You're thinking about 2, 3, 5 years ahead. In my years at St. Paul's, I was always keeping 50 years ahead in the back of my head as to how the neighborhood would change and so forth. A snapshot doesn't tell you context, but if you have the context, if you can see how things fit together, then you can have a chance to do a much better job. You can see what the reality is. Now, this is a picture of the Twin Cities. What do you see different in that picture from before, or from now? Well, it's missing some roads. Some roads are named differently. That's the Twin Cities about 1985. You'll notice there isn't much labeled for third ring, fourth ring suburbs. There's no Egan on there. No Apple Valley. But it's a pretty good map of the Twin Cities within the second loop of freeways. But that's our city. And the notable thing is this little blue line here.
What's 18? Is that 169?
County Road 18, that's 169, yeah. That was known as County Road 18 for many, many years. Yeah. 169 used to be the East River or West River Road right here. They rename roads, but okay. Anyway, so see this blue thing up here? Winds around in northern Minnesota for a couple hundred miles, and finally it decides to head down towards Minneapolis and St. Paul. And it comes down, it's called the Mississippi. Up here, the Rum River comes into it, so it gets to be a lot bigger. That's why Anoka was important, because it was also a fording place where they could take wagons across, and we'll see what kind of wagons. And it came down to Minneapolis, and it's going north and south right here, almost just like an arrow. But then all of a sudden it turns almost east and west in downtown Minneapolis. And then all of a sudden it gets past downtown, and then it drops south, picks up the Minnesota River, and then it joins this way, comes together, and along here it's wide. There are several hundred feet of swamp on both sides there and there, but up here it comes to St. Paul. It hits a sandstone cliff, and it has kind of dug the sandstone away, so you can step off of this sandstone step into 20 feet of water. That's why St. Paul is there. That was the place where starting in the late 1820s, 200 years ago, they began to have the steamship stop. So the Mississippi goes down this way, picks up the St. Croix, and heads off towards New Orleans. Now, every city is where it's at for a reason. Why is New York where New York is? What's there? Hudson River? Yeah, it's a good port. It's is it out in the middle of North Dakota? What's it on? Yeah, it's right on the coast. Good port, good harbor, Atlantic Ocean. You notice all those red dots down the Atlantic? See all the red dots down the Pacific? Down the middle, you see all the red dots along the Mississippi, and you can see them along the Ohio. The Colorado, yeah, is a pretty steep river, and the main reason that Denver happened out there was that was the last place to get water before you went over a pretty good pass. Yeah, going over the Rockies. It was a place where people kind of stopped and got their act together. Same thing was true in St. Louis in the earliest days. But out here there's a city called Atlanta. Atlanta's not on a seacoast. It's not on a river. Now, they didn't just say one day, let's go build a great big city in the middle of Georgia. You know, I mean, how many big cities do you see in the middle of North Dakota? Do people just say, let's go build a big city there? Brasilia in Brazil was built that way. It'll be interesting to see if in a couple hundred years, should the Lord tarry, if it's still there. But Atlanta is out here. And now, why is Atlanta there? So here's Atlanta. Charlotte, Birmingham, Chattanooga, Montgomery, Columbus, Savannah, all these big cities. And right here between them is Atlanta. No river. Nope. But there was a lot of industry there that developed there, but they didn't have water power.
Is it because it's a crossroads of all those other cities?
And I'll give you a hint, 20 years before the Civil War, there was almost nothing there. But a technology came in that changed everything. Have you ever seen Gone with the Wind? This is the rail yard in Atlanta. And when Sherman came through, he put Atlanta in his sights because that was a railroad crossing where all kinds of railroads came through that town. And if he could wipe out all of the various routes of all of the railroads going all over the South, because they all had this one spot in the middle.
Well, that's why they call them Sherman's hairpins, right?
Right, and that's what's going on right here, is heating up these the rails. Once they were bent, they couldn't be straightened out with the technology they had then. And the South didn't have a lot of heavy industry, because that took power, and the water power, and all the machine shops were up in the north. So the Army map of Georgia, it's right in the middle, is of course Atlanta, and that became the site where Sherman marched through. Not a very popular guy to this day down there. So now, Minnesota was shaped by many things, and a lot of it was transportation. And the transportation decided where things are at. Just like in Atlanta, having the rail lines cross there created the city. Now, today there's all kinds of other things there besides a railroad. But the railroads created Atlanta. Now, when the first Europeans came through, the French came through in the late 1600s, and they came as missionaries. They didn't stay very long in one place, but they kind of scoped things out. And when they came in, they didn't come up the Mississippi. They came in through Lake Superior. They came in through the Apostle Islands, that area up here, came up the Bois Brûlé, the burnt stick, burnt woods. We know it as the Brule trout stream today. And they paddled up the Brule, and then they caught the headwaters of the Namakagon or the St. Croix, and they transferred to that, and then they went up things like the Snake and the Kettle. Snake was really important because it went east and west, and it got them over towards the big lakes.
Isn't there a big tourist thing up on the Snake River now called the Fur Trading Post?
Yeah, that fur trading post is outside of Pine City.
Yeah.
It's really a pretty neat deal.
I've been there on a big tour.
That lasted for exactly 1 year.
The actual trading post.
They had a trading post there for 1 year until the Americans had bought the Louisiana Purchase, and they claimed that land. And that was a Northwest Fur Trading Post, and Northwest Fur Trading Post was a Canadian outfit, as was the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, the beavers had been trapped out of there 100 years earlier, but they still had other things that could be traded, and those people wanted goods which were sold at very high prices. Now, and at that time, the Ojibwe, starting in the late mid-1700s to the mid-1800s, came in. They were an eastern tribe, and they came in, and they had been told that they would find food growing on the water, and that's where they were supposed to stop, kind of like the Mormons or the Mexican myth, you know. That's where they were supposed to stop. Well, that was Mille Lacs. Yeah, wild rice. And so they wanted that land. Now, they always had great connections with the French, and the French, and most of the people that ran the Northwest Fur Company had French connections, and they would sell guns to the Ojibwe. But the British and the American wouldn't sell guns to the Dakota. So you had bow and arrows versus guns, and gradually the Dakota were pushed out until a treaty was settled in the 1840s. But anyway, the first European contact came through Lake Superior. So that was in the 1600s, and all of these rivers over here, all of them were very important for trade. You know, here's the Crow Wing, here's the Rum, Snake, Kettle. Kettle is a pretty tough canoeing river, unless it's real high water, and then it's deadly. You'll notice the Cannon River down here. We'll talk about that. So Louisiana Purchase was made in 1803, and it had gone back and forth between the French and the Spanish and back to the French, and then Napoleon needed a little more money, so Thomas Jefferson offered him a bunch of money at a time he was desperate, And he bought all that. And they thought, a lot of Americans thought that he was absolutely out of his mind to buy, this big swath of land. They had no idea what was out there. They thought that there might be a water route all the way to the west coast. They thought there might be dinosaurs. They had found dinosaur bones in places, and they had no idea what was out there. So they sent out, right away, Lewis and Clark, and they got up to Mandan the first winter, and they learned all about venereal disease because the Mandans had a habit of offering their wives to people to keep them warm. I think it was warm, yeah. Anyway, but on his heels was Zebulon Pike. Zebulon Pike was very young, but highly respected, and he was given the job to come up here and to buy land all along the Mississippi to build forts, and all the way up the Missouri River. And so Zebulon Pike bought all these spots, some of which were never used. He bought one location out on by the other side of the river from Hastings, so it would be on Point Douglas, in that area, across from Prescott. And he bought Fort Snelling, 9-mile strip. And nobody else was allowed to settle there except for the soldiers, and it was a great overlook, so they could keep the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Fur Company out of there, and they could control their frontier and show that this now belongs to the United States. So 1805, that's why the date I used, he came in 1805 and bought that land and laid claim to this area. So that site was available, and finally, 1819, they had money and they sent some troops, this time down the Ohio and up the Mississippi, and they got here about, I think, late August, September of 1819, which is 200 years ago next year. Have you heard anything about that yet? This is the first permanent settlement of European people in Minnesota, and it happened 200 years ago next year. They came in that fall, about froze themselves to death, living in tents that first winter, and then they started building a fort. And this is about where the closest I can figure out that the 9-mile land grant was given. Here's the Minnesota River, which they called the St. Peter River, and this is, downtown Minneapolis is right here, and it comes down the gorge and it meets together and then widens out because it slows down and heads towards St. Paul. Now, so this is where we're at right now. You're in the X, and this is Fort Snelling. Now, this land, after things kind of got started and got going, before the Civil War, they sold that land off. And the guy just he farmed it and did a few things with it. Then the Civil War came up, and they needed a place to bring soldiers together. So he sold it back to the United States government at a healthy profit. And it's remained government land, so much of it, and nice flat fields, nice area for the soldiers to be able to cut wood, nice area for them to grow crops. And I mean, they couldn't go run the supermarket. They had to basically.
Does that include the modern day airport?
Yes, include the airport and the National Cemetery. And that's why those things are there, because that big piece of land was held open by the government. And
The zoo is there too? Is the zoo down there? That's in Apple Valley.
Zoo's in Apple Valley. That's down,
McAndrews and Cedar.
like down in here, right?
Yep. Or even further south. Well, yeah.
Down in here. So, and you're asking Little Canada, I grew up right here. And currently I live, for the last 29 years, right here. Anyway, so this was where the fort was. And on this side of the river, they never used the claim on the St. Paul side, but on this side of the river you could only have military people, and they also left in some Presbyterian missionaries, the Pond brothers. And actually, 1830s, there was quite a revival that happened at Fort Snelling. But that's for another time. So here's where you're at. Here's the river. And so this is, see, there's this chain of forts: Fort Armstrong, Fort Crawford, where the Wisconsin River comes in, and Fort Snelling, and here's Fort Atkinson. Now, another main player up here is going to be Selkirk's colony. We call it Winnipeg today. In the late 1700s, The British lords pushed through legislation to end the way that land was used since the medieval feudalism time. And since probably the, I don't know, 800s, 900s, every town there was a lord, and in the town there were peasants or vassals or whatever they're going to call them. You know, the common people that we're probably all descended from. Serfs, if you're in Russia, yeah, paisanos, and in Italy. And they had to each give, their house was owned by their master. There were a few freeholders and a few people who were merchants and that kind of stuff, but most were hearty peasants. And they each had a little piece of land that they could work for their own food and vegetables and stuff. And then there were common areas, common wood areas where they could cut wood. There were common areas where they could graze a couple sheep, maybe a cow. And there were common, all this stuff was held in common, and they were passed down from family to family to family. Well, they didn't work very well for modern agriculture, so they passed laws called the Enclosure Act, which all of a sudden, especially in Scotland and Ireland, it drove thousands, tens of thousands of landowners that had been on that land for hundreds of years, took away everything they had. And they were living in dire poverty in Edinburgh and in London. This is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. David, you know, if you've ever read any of the Dickens stuff about the poverty there. So, Oliver Twist, that kind of stuff. So, Lord Selkirk was the seventh son in the family, and the first six died off. He had been trained in the arts, he'd been trained in science, he'd been trained in a whole bunch of stuff, and he was supposed to be a gentleman. He wouldn't have to, as the seventh son, would ever not have to serve in the House of Lords. But all of a sudden he finds himself as a politician, and he's an educated politician, he's compassionate. He's also one of the members of the ownership of the Hudson's Bay Company. He's invested a lot of money in the Hudson's Bay Company. And he goes to the House of Lords, we have all these bloody Scots in Edinburgh and our cities, and it's a terrible thing. Why don't we take these people? We're having trouble with this Northwest Company competing with us. Let's send them over to the New World. We'll send them and they can help Hudson's Bay Company, and we'll kill two birds with one stone. And so they vote to send these people over to Hudson's Bay. So they come over in the springtime, and they spend all summer rowing upstream up the Red River of the North from Hudson's Bay to Winnipeg. And they arrive late in August. Minor points, they have no food, they have no shelter, they have no clothing for 40, 50 below zero. And they come to Hudson's Bay, the people they're supposed to come to help. We're here now to be your help. And the British are so excited, they say, well, we don't have anything to give you, good luck. So then the Northwest Company, their dire enemies, take them over and take care of them. And then the next year another group comes in. So they end up siding with the Northwest Company. Anyway, and these Scots are up there, and they're starving to death, and they're freezing to death. So they start gradually coming down. They start escaping Winnipeg to move to Point South. At one point, they want to see if they can raise some cows. So again, about 1820s, they send a handful of guys and all the money they've got to buy cows at $100 a head. Now, a good rifle, a passable rifle, was about $3, and a really good rifle, the best of the best, was probably about 20, like a good Hawken, heavy-duty Hawken. $100, and half of them die or are eaten between St. Louis and Winnipeg. So these are $200 cows, and they were that desperate. Oh yeah, it would be just incredible. And can you imagine driving them through the absolute wilderness of Missouri and all the way up?
Or hitting the wood line in Minnesota.
Yeah. So now while that's going on, then so that's 1812 when that happens. I'm sorry, did I say 1812? Then in 1820, the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company merge, and now they have a monopoly. They quit fighting, so now they can pay whatever they want for furs coming in. They've got control, complete political, military, police, everything control of the whole west half of Canada, which is called Rupert's Land, named after the king's brother, who was part of Hudson's Bay. So then, you have the English, and a lot of the people with the English were Scots who came over here for this job, and they were very good at it. But the French, who had interbred with native people, created their own culture. They still have a separate culture. You have First Nations or Indian people. You have Métis, which means mixed. We used to use the term half-breed. So the Canadians call them First Peoples, and they call them Métis. And then there's the English, and there are the French. I mean, there's 4 different cultures even in Winnipeg. But the Métis began to take their furs, and they began to detour around Winnipeg. They were the couriers, and they started coming down from Selkirk's colony all the way down, first down this side of the river, but then after about 20 years of that, the Dakota said, you guys are killing all of our buffalo. And so they said, you got to stay over on this side. So we'll look at that in a little bit. But so these were called ox carts, and they had 6-foot wheels. So they were like 4-wheel drive. They could go over stumps. They could go through streams. You know, they're 6-foot tall wheels. And they never greased them, so they squeaked. You could hear them for miles. And those ran until the 1880s. We'll see pictures. Okay, so here we have Fort Snelling. And then in the 1830s, as this gets to be a going concern, this French-Canadian Métis come down, and they start selling, see Canadian settlers? These are all French-Canadians, Métis, and they start selling whiskey on that side of the river. And after a few months of having drunken soldiers, with tears in their eyes, the soldiers were ordered to burn down their houses and send them away. So they moved up into this area, and that was when they finally got around to surveying their land grant. They discovered that was still within the fort. So then they came up here and they settled. And the leader was a guy by the name of Pig's Eye Perron. Pig's Eye. And so they called this Pig's Eye's Landing up here. And so if you wanted to send a letter to this area, you would send it to John Smith, Pig's Eye. Now, a couple things were going on at that time. When the French came in, they named a bunch of stuff. But the British didn't understand French. So they came down, they saw this river here was called the Rivière Sans-Pierre. Rivière Sans-Pierre, which means, well, the British saw, well, that Sans-Pierre, it must be the St. Peter River, Sans-Pierre. Pierre means Peter, that must be the St. Peter River. So they called it that until the 1860s. Well, sans doesn't mean saint, it means without. And Pierre also means stone, without stone. It was the stoneless, muddy-bottomed river. Further down was the Rivière des Canons. And the British said, Cannon River, it must be Cannon, the river of cannons. So how did the Indians ever get cannons? So we'll call it the Cannon River. So they called it the Cannon River. It's still called that today. Actually, Rivière des Canons means the river of canoes. Okay, anyway, and then this is what Fort Snelling looked like, and then back in the late 50s, early 60s, they happened to run a freeway right through it, but that's another story for another time. So we've got the fort gets there, and as soon as they get there, I've already known about this falls. Now, waterfalls, before there was electricity or steam or any of that stuff, waterfalls were the most powerful source of energy. One of the earliest places the Industrial Revolution came to the United States was Lowell, Massachusetts. And they had cotton mills, and they could weave cotton, and they could make gun parts, and they could do anything because they had power. They could, from all the water that came through the dams. And the New Englanders, with all their streams coming down, knew how to build dams and different kind of water wheels, and they could grind grain and saw logs. Well, the falls was noted right away. This is a famous picture. He doesn't seem very excited about things. This is Father Hennepin. He named Hennepin Avenue. That's named after him, Louis Hennepin, and he came here on the day of his saint, his own personal saint, same that he is named after, and so it was named after Saint Anthony of Padua, and this is what the 19th century artists thought that it looked like. Now, other people, okay, so as soon as the falls becomes very central, and right away when they build Fort Snelling, this road, it says road to the falls. This map was drawn in 1820. It's the oldest map that we know of. And here's the road here's the Mississippi River. Here's the Little River, that's before it was a band. We call that Minnehaha Creek, after the 1870s Song of Hiawatha craze. Here is the road from St. Anthony Falls to Lake Calhoun. We call that today Hennepin Avenue. This brook, Bassett Creek, is actually all underground now in storm sewers. This is the road from the fort to the village, Shakopee, and the Shakopee village, that's Old Shakopee Road. So those roads go back much earlier than that, but they widened this, and this became the road from the fort to the falls. And you've been on that. You were on part of that tonight. Pardon? Hiawatha. Yep, right. Now that's what some think that originally the falls looked like back in the beginning. About a 40-foot drop falls, but lots of rocks everywhere because there's about 20 feet of soft limestone, 100 feet of sandstone, and then finally you come to good limestone. As the water came over the falls, it would create turbulence and it would dig out this soft sandstone that's every place in the Twin Cities. When you go through the dirt and you go through this 20-foot limestone cap, then you have this soft stuff. So as the water went over the top, the falls kept getting undercut, and then the rock would fall. And so 10,000 years ago, they claim that the Falls of St. Anthony was out by Fort Snelling, and gradually it marched up the river. Well, as they started using the river for the falls for their power, water for power has to either be turned by a flowing stream. That's rather inefficient. The most efficient way is to have water from above the falls come in, drop down a tube where there's a propeller on the bottom, and then you need to have an exhaust on the bottom. This is called the head race. This is called the tail race. And so water comes in, drops down this tube for 40 feet, tons and tons and tons of water, thousands of horsepower. And that's what they had to, but they had to be able to stop the falls from moving. So you can see that the falls were constantly moving. These are some of the earliest things that were built there. This is the original sawmill for Fort Snelling. Downtown Minneapolis would be here. University of Minnesota would be over here. Look at all the big rocks. If they ever took those dams out, this would be a really cool whitewater kayak route. Now, to complicate matters is that you had the Ojibwe people basically here in the upper part, in the wooded part, and in 1825, when they finally settled the treaty, this line became the line between the Ojibwe and the Dakota, but they kept fighting over it because the Ojibwe took over all the wild rice stuff, which the Dakota had. And so this area was settled by treaty with the Ojibwe in 1837, ditto down here. This area next, finally some 1889 up here. 1851, this whole area was deeded away, and they cheated the Dakota, and I won't tell you the story now. I can tell you some other time.
Is that the grass story?
The which one?
Let there be grass.
Well, that's where it ends up in. Yeah.
What year was that one again?
Well, they stole the land in 1851, And the uprising was 1862.
Because it was the lesser known, like, because it was during the Civil War, but it was a war going on. Didn't have any soldiers.
Yeah. So, now, the Twin Cities is not only shaped by all these other factors, but the fifth one is shaped by the roads. And this triangle is the backbone of the Twin Cities. Hiawatha, the road from the fort to the falls. When the French Canadians got settled up here, the road from the fort across the river by ferry boat and up to Pig's Eye, that's the Whiskey Road. And so that's West 7th. And I've got the colors wrong on here, this one, I fixed that further on. And then you've got you could make stuff at the falls, but because this is a wicked, wicked, wicked rapids, they couldn't get rid of it. So you could have sawmills and all kinds of stuff there. But everything had to go through the port. The only place they could load ships was at Pig's Eye. So this is University Avenue. This is the first train route. This is I-94. This is connected all the way up to Winnipeg, University Avenue. It turns and it goes up this side.
47.
Yep, all the way to Anoka. So this triangle, okay, this is where the colors are wrong here, but where's the first roads? Right there. Where's the first railroad tracks? Right there. Where's the first big lines of the streetcar? Right there. Where's the first, where the freeways go? Well, this one and this one got voted down by their neighborhoods. This one happened right away, and it's still extremely important. But now, where's the first light rail? Right here. Where's the second light rail? Right here. Where they're discussing a light rail or a streetcar? Right here. Because this is Bloomington, third largest city in Minneapolis. Here's here's Hiawatha, and see all the railroad tracks and stuff along there? Oops. And that's the blue line. And this is going to be the red line, and that's West 7th Street, just like straight like an arrow. And this is University Avenue, the green line today. And this is still the basic skeleton. This is the framework on which the Twin Cities is built. Everything else is built around that triangle of those three cities. And again, because the fort was held open, that's where the fort was, that's where the airport is, that's where Mall of America is.
Do you know anything about the history of the ownership of what's the family's name again who owns Mall of America?
They're up at,
Italian family? Or?
yeah, they were originally from Alberta, Edmonton. I don't know much. That was in the 80s, and no, we're still back in the early 1800s here, except we're looking at the map from today. Anyway, so from this area here, you take a look at this red spot. That is the shape of the settled areas of the Twin Cities in 1900. After World War II, even, houses were only built out to about 45th. South, yeah. And so this is 1900. This is 1920, 1930. Now, if you notice, okay, so here's Richfield. By the time we get to 1950, you've got a lobe coming out in Richfield. St. Louis Park was a railroad stop, so it and Hopkins developed a little earlier. Robbinsdale started developing, but all of this is after the war. Columbia Heights, that was way out in the country. Roseville was barely beginning to be settled. We lived here. 1940, and my parents moved up into this area, and they didn't have electricity till 47. You know, it's hard for us to comprehend. They had hand-pumped water and kerosene lights from 40 to 47. Anyway, now notice, where is the biggest lobe? Wired technology to the rescue. Okay, so look at the extension in each of those decades, and where is the biggest, repeatedly, where do you see the biggest lobes of that growth? You see the lobe here, and lobe here, and lobe here, and lobe here? What is that? Hiawatha Avenue. This is University Avenue, so you've got early settlement out here around the Moo and the railroad stuff out in St. Anthony Village. No, I'm sorry, St. Anthony Park. And then you've got the West 7th lobes that you can see the lobe going out here. I drew a straight line, but West 7th is more like this. Anyway, so these streets have were very, very important for the development of the Twin Cities. Of course, the railroad, all the railroad lines, came through this area and built and filled this. This is St. Paul, and it's the port. So this is a picture from the 1840s or 50s, and this is from about the top of the High Bridge in St. Paul. So here is the city of St. Paul. Here is what's called the lower landing, and that's where St. Paul began, because down here you could unload a boat, and then you could go up this gradual hill to get up on top of this bluff that's 100 feet tall. You can't unload a boat if you have to, somehow get up a straight vertical cliff. And
Close to where like Lower Town now is called.
yeah, this would be Lower Town, right? Yeah, yeah, that is right where the St. Paul Union Depot is, the Spud, which was just reopened a couple of years, and it's beautiful. That's where the Spud is, right there. And then the other one, the upper levee, because remember the water's flowing this way, so this is lower, and then this is upstream, so this is the upper levee, and that's here by the Science Museum. And this would always flood. In the beginning of the 20th century, this was an Italian community, and it flooded all the time. Now this is the west side. If you don't live in St. Paul, or in the Twin Cities, none of this stuff makes sense, because North Minneapolis is northwest of Minneapolis, northeast Minneapolis is straight north of Minneapolis, southeast Minneapolis is actually straight east of northeast Minneapolis. And then St. Paul, because, okay, St. Paul is here, and then the west side is directly south of St. Paul, but it's on the west bank of the river. And you go up a little higher, and you then hit, first you have the west side flats, and then you have the west side, main part of the west side, and then above that is West St. Paul, which is actually, all three of them are south of St. Paul. And then there's the West End, which is out West 7th Street, but that's different from the west side. You got all this, right?
That's all fed to the river.
Yeah. And then, of course, North St. Paul is actually north and east of St. Paul, and South St. Paul is south and east of St. Paul. Got all that? So anyway, this is, if you look at St. Paul directly from the south, about about from the Robert Street Bridge, this is Sweet Hollow, which still exists. The railroad tracks don't go through it anymore. The Northern Pacific went through here. This is where the Great Northern went through and then came across, and this is called the Trout Brook. And this is the steepest piece of railroad track between here and the other side of the Rocky Mountains. It was the 3 miles to get up to the Dale Street shops. Anyway, so this is the lower landing, right in this area where the St. Paul Union Depot is, and this is the upper landing. And St. Paul is still built obviously on that structure. Now, so we've talked about the Winnipeg trade. Now, if we look at all these things coming down here, these are the routes. This is the Wood Road, which was right past my son's parents-in-law's house up by Rothsay, and all these are branches of these trails. These trails were all connected and all part of the Woods Road. And this is the road along the Red River and so forth. And all of these today, this is 29, and this is 75, and this is Highway 59, and Highway 10, and Highway 371. All of those roads, and 94, are all exactly within a couple hundred yards of the old ox cart tracks. And they would come down, and they would they would want to make sure I'm not saying something wrong here. They would come down here, and this is where a bunch of them came together, and this is Anoka. That's why Anoka was so early, because that's where they cross, and then they came down University Avenue to Pig's Eye. So University Avenue is a part of that original, parallel to that original one. There was photography. In fact, there are movies in the 1880s, early movies you can find on the Minnesota Historical Society. And look at these big, great big, strong wheels. And they pulled them with oxes. Oxes took a lot less maintenance than horses. They didn't have to be fed anything special. They only moved 2 miles an hour, but they just kept going. They didn't get sick. Horses are kind of like driving a Lamborghini. They just need constant attention. So these guys did this at 2 miles an hour because they could make more money. And until the railroad came through in the late 1880s, this was the trade between the United States and stuff coming up the Mississippi River from anywhere to get to Winnipeg. Oh, this is, if you've ever been over on Main Street in northeast Minneapolis, this is like Procnon, Maine, and that whole area. Faces the river. All right. So then the land was stolen. I mean, they settled the treaty with the Indians in 1851. So 1852, all of a sudden, like mushrooms, Minneapolis on the west side of the river begins to build. So here's Washington Avenue. This would be downtown Minneapolis where the tall buildings are. 1850s. 1855, they built the first bridge. This is a suspension bridge, and it's the first bridge any place across the Mississippi, anywhere in the United States. This is the first bridge, 1855. And it's built by the people themselves, keep heavily loaded teams and chubby people 100 feet apart. And my wife would just go nuts going across this thing. She hates swaying bridges. But that's why the modern bridge is built like it is. It looks just like this. It copies the 1855 bridge. Then they built another suspension bridge, and they built it wrong, and that only lasted about 10 years. And then right around the turn of the last century, they built an all-iron bridge that had you could look through it. It had an iron grate bed, and you could drove across it, and you could look right down to it. Was freaky. Yeah, and they just tore that down, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago, 25 years ago or so. So this is Minneapolis in 1867, looking from the northeast to the southwest. So here you've got that first bridge, and this comes out at Bridge Square, which is where Hennepin Avenue and Nicollet Avenue come together.
Those same blocks exist too.
Yes. And so these are the mills. There's already that many mills. You notice that there's a dam in here that they almost lost the falls. They were digging underneath it, and they lost the falls, and all of the mills went dry, and they had to bring in the Corps of Engineers, and it took them a couple of years. It was a real devastating thing. Here are the mills. Here's the parking lot for the Metrodome. Oh, wait a minute. You're sitting over about here. Now notice the first streets all go parallel or perpendicular to the river, so they keep turning, like in the northeast and so forth. This is Spirit Island that was blown out in the 50s. This is, there's Hennepin Island and there's Nicollet Island, named after Father Nicollet. This is the entire University of Minnesota right there. That's the whole works. That's Old Main. The 35W bridge had fallen down again. And over here it looks like the Indians in Buffalo are going to come over the hill any minute. This is Loring Park. This is the falls in 1867. That's what was on the north side of it, looking to the north. Now 1879, the city's a lot bigger, and notice now they've turned the next roads north, south, east, west. We can't keep putting these roads in crooked and funny, so they straighten all the roads out, and you'll see the turn if you about 5-6 blocks north of here. We now have a 3rd Avenue bridge. We have more mills. We now have one building at the University of Minnesota with a couple of little houses or something. You're still, where you're at is still over here. Now, 1901, all kinds of stuff has happened. So now you've got, because this side had opened up and the railroad, the Great Northern Railroad originally came to this side of the river, James J. Hill builds this incredibly expensive stone arch bridge, one of the most majestic pieces of stonework any place in the United States. And because they're arches and it curves, each of those blocks had to be cut to be the right dimensions to make an arch, but then it had to be a little bigger on one end. And those old people were smart. Here's the Horseshoe Falls, which is still there. These are the sawmills that were on this side. There's one mill on the north side. That was Pillsbury. And Pillsbury wanted that to be the place where the fancy people lived. They were going to, he owned the water rights, and he wanted to build a whole bunch of, over here, see all these mills? They all get water from one canal owned by Washburn. And Washburn got the rent for all the water. And his mill was the last one to get water. And so he was the last to shut down in the low water parts of the year.
Wow, which side?
This is all gone.
Is that Guthrie where your mouse is?
Guthrie is about here. And I believe the Washburn A mill it's here. This is the Washburn A mill.
What is the mill? Old Mill Museum or whatever?
Yeah, that's here.
Yeah.
Now in the 1870s, there was a spark and it blew up. The Washburn A mill disappeared. Thank God it was a Sunday, only 14 people were killed. It took out every window in Minneapolis. It took out windows in St. Paul. Impossible to imagine, but it was a dust. They didn't know what dust explosions were, and in fact, scientists didn't know what it was, and so they had fire insurance, but they didn't have explosion insurance, and so it went all the way, I think, to the Supreme Court, and they won because it was a fire. Sure. Anyway, so then they went to roller mills instead of having grindstones. Now, all of this comes over here, and it all feeds over to this area up here. It's not on the picture, which was the Minneapolis Union Depot. This is Hiawatha Avenue and the railroad lines along it. Going to be a pretty good sized town. So here's 1912. Here's 1915. There's the City Hall, built about 1890 something. So here we are in Minneapolis. These are all the modern neighborhoods of Minneapolis, and they were designated in the late 70s. We take them for granted. Sharon Sells Belton was a part of the administration at that point, and she couldn't remember. I interviewed her for a paper, and she could remember when they were broken into neighborhoods. Now, this used to be the entire Phillips neighborhood, and it was cut into 4 pieces. But there are actually 3 Minneapolises. And I don't know if one is Northeast Minneapolis, which originally was called St. Anthony. And that was a separate city until 1873. And that's older because you could settle on that side. And then there's South Minneapolis, which includes actually all of this area. And it was kept unified by putting the railroad line underground. And then there's North Minneapolis. And this was the place for more than 100 years where black people and Jewish people lived, primarily. And that was kind of an immigrant area. These were Scandinavians up in Northeast Minneapolis. After the turn of the century, there were a lot of Italians, awful lot of Eastern Europeans. But we're going to talk about, so Pillsbury's mill is right in here. All the South Minneapolis mills, the 36 mills on the one thing. Oh, why couldn't they do that up here? Because when they were going to build this canal, they hit a great big cave, and they had no way to bridge the cave, so they couldn't build any more mills along the north side of the river, or the east bank. So then the railroads came through. At one point, there were 36 railroads. So this is CBD, Central Business District of St. Paul. And look at all of the railroad yards. All that you see here that's dark black, those are all railroad yards. And, you know, the Great Northern had a tremendous amount of area along in here. And these really cut the city apart. This is Hiawatha, and this is the one that was put underground, and that kept all of South Minneapolis unified. And so the city grew this way, Minneapolis grew this way, as well as out, and then St. Paul grew this way because they were blocked in by the railroad, so that it developed south and west, like up towards Highland Park and McAllister Groveland first. But look at the amount of land. Now, like this whole area, and even this whole area, you can't get across these railroad crossings except every half mile or every mile. Some of these areas, like between Dale and Lexington, or Lexington and Snelling, there is no crossing for an entire mile. You can't cross the road yard. So that's why a house in Como is worth, you know, maybe $50,000 or $100,000 more than a house that's in Frogtown, because they're so completely cut off from each other. Over here, the main railroad west of Minneapolis, today this is where 394 goes out. This whole thing is virtually gone. The impound lot is there and so forth, and this is all built on Swampy Creek. This is built on swamp. This is built on swamp. This is all built on swampy land. But it was flat because it's by the rivers. So they couldn't move dirt, but they learned how to build railroads for tons and tons and tons of train on top of swamp. And they were much better at swamp than they were at moving dirt until modern times. So there is the first locomotive. This is the William Crooks. And this guy with the beard here in the middle, this is James J. Hill. And he was profoundly rich, the empire builder. Well, there was a Southern Pacific, which was the southern route, the Union Pacific down the middle. There was the Great Northern, and then there was the Northern Pacific. Now, at one point, J.P. Morgan and James J. Hill pulled together and bought enough stock that they controlled both the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. And Harrison, who owned the Union Pacific, saw that there was going to be a northern monopoly. There was only 4 routes across the country. And so he was a big donor to Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt wanted to break up monopolies. So Teddy Roosevelt sued James J. Hill, and James J. Hill lost. And so they weren't able to tie the Great Northern together with the Northern Pacific. But, you know, then Amtrak came and they ended up all together anyway. This is... Yeah. Now, you see, this is the William Crooks. It's 2, 2, and 4. 4 driver wheels. It's a very small, this came in 1862. My grandfather was a machinist for the Great Northern. And in 1947, and this is a modern picture, in 1947, 1948, he personally rebuilt all of this structure, all of the driving rods, all the way back. He was an expert on this, and he was one of the last guys that could do that. So he personally built that. I've snuck under the chain there and looked, and for the flashlight, and there's all kinds of places where it says DSS, Dale Street Shops, GNRR, Great Northern Railway, and then dates in 47 and 48. And I know my grandpa put those dates on. I was wondering if he put his initials any place, but I couldn't find it. But maybe someday. This is at the, it used to be in the St. Paul Union Depot until the 70s, and then they moved it up, and they took it apart and moved it up to the Transportation Museum in Duluth. Okay, so this again, the first railroad ran between St. Paul and St. Anthony. So they could get stuff from the falls over to the port. Because our railroad, our little 10-mile railroad, and even as they built onto it, going further west to the farmers, it wasn't connected to any other railroads until the late 1870s. Everything went out by the river. Not only did we have all these railroads, but then we had a genius by the name of Lowry. And Lowry had a dream of building an incredible streetcar system. And you can find YouTube things on the streetcar system in the Twin Cities. We had the greatest streetcar system in the world. Went all the way from Lake Minnetonka all the way to the St. Croix, to Stillwater, Oak Park Heights, to the prison, so people could visit the prison. Then up here in White Bear, they had an amusement park here, and they had an amusement park out on Lake Excelsior. They had boats that went out onto Lake Excelsior as they were out there, and they just brought one of those back up from the bottom, and it was still in good shape after 75 years or so. And it now does cruises out there. It hadn't, because it was under the water, it was cold, it didn't deteriorate. But look at the route, look at all these routes we had. And this is 1933, and notice how all these routes go out, and they kind of, here's Hiawatha, here's University Avenue, here's West 7th. A lot of those rails are still there, in fact. Here it took a side trip to go past the Veterans Hospital. Incredible gift that we had. Nobody lived more than about 4 or 5 blocks from a streetcar line, all heading in. And then as you get out here, they kind of spread out further and further, but it was a great system. But it was all torn up. This guy, Towley and Osana, back in right after World War II, got in control of the system. And they said, oh, this is old-fashioned, old-fashioned. And they got kickbacks from the General Motors bus division. And then they tore out all the copper wires, and they tore out a lot of the steel rails, millions and millions of dollars worth, and they sold it to scrap yards for about 5 cents on the dollar, what it was worth. And they got huge kickbacks. And they were crooks, and they destroyed the system. Some of those cars, which were built in the Twin Cities, are still functioning in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. And so there they are. He's getting the check for the materials there. They burnt the cars to get the materials out of them. Now we're spending billions of dollars to build light rail. Now, realize that before the automobile, these things were privately owned, and they had to make a profit. Now we are subsidizing every ride on the light rail out to the Mall of America. I think you pay about, for every dollar you pay, I think it's subsidized about $3. Yeah, and because it's better than having to build more roads, build more so forth. It's cheaper to subsidize that. And the response to the light rail has been much greater. The estimates of how many people are going to use the light rail the first year, the critics looked at it and said, this is impossible. You're never going to get this many people to ride. You're saying more people are going to ride on this than go to Disneyland every year. Well, when the first year was over, twice as many people rode as they had projected. So that way it's been a success, but it does cost us money. I think every round trip ride up the heavy rail to Big Lake is subsidized by the government about $75 per person.
What's the heavy rail?
Well, they have a commuter rail that runs on the regular big railroad tracks. Streetcars go on light tracks that are closer together. Okay. So we had that system, and then we changed it over to buses, and almost all the bus lines that go in the original cities are on the same place as the streetcar lines were. And then the freeways came through. After Eisenhower saw how Hitler could move his troops on the Autobahns, he said, "We need some." He didn't talk that way. Eisenhower said, "We need some superhighways here, so in case of a problem, we could move people." And so, federal policy was to put them through where poor people lived, particularly where black people lived. And so the Rondo district of St. Paul over here completely disappeared. And the siting as to how they sited and what they kept and what they didn't keep is a whole nother story. But it was very racist, and it destroyed a lot of good things. But you can see where the freeways are. Where's 94? It's right where the ox cart track was. And so this has become the defining, loop around the Twin Cities. Now we have, this is 169. We've got 494. We really need a loop out about here. We've got 610 now up in here. That was just beginning to be built in the 80s. We got all this development coming now. This 36 is now going to be a major freeway. So let's focus in now on our neighborhood just before we get ready to go. Okay, so this area, this is 94, Hiawatha, Lake Street, and 35W. This is what they called the Phillips neighborhood. So this is Ventura Village up here, which is, you're right here. And this is West Phillips, and this is Central Phillips. And what do you think this is? You guys are so smart. Okay, so it was split up so that it could, for a whole bunch of reasons, and because it was the largest, had the most people in it of any of the neighborhoods. And one neighborhood faction would get in control, and they would be in control, and then $250,000 would just disappear. And then another group would force them out, another group would take over, and the same thing would happen. So finally, the people up here said, we want to secede from the Union, and so they split it, and the city allowed that to happen. Now, what happened to this neighborhood? Why did this neighborhood become the highest crime, poorest neighborhood by the 1980s? Well, let's go back to the 1880s. At that point, there was a competition where the fancy people were going to live. And so some of the fancy, Pillsbury, with Pillsbury's Mill, Pillsbury's Church, which is identical to this building, except it's made cheaper, it's made out of sandstone, and it doesn't have a balcony. And Pillsbury's University, he was a great backer of the university. He wanted the fancy people to live up here. Well, Dayton, who built this, and other big names they named streets after, they thought that this South Minneapolis area along Park Avenue should be the place where the fancy people live. Park Avenue. As you drive up Park Avenue, guess what's straight ahead of you all the way? Did you happen to ever notice what's right straight ahead of you, right in the middle of the road ahead of you? City Hall. All the way up. City Hall is right in, and the message is clear. We who own these mansions, we own that sucker. Anyway, so what happened then was that, well, let's talk about Phillips neighborhood. It was the highest crime neighborhood in Minneapolis through the 80s and the 90s and the beginning of the aughts. Had the highest level of poverty. It's now North Minneapolis has become worse. 83% of the housing is not owner occupied. In this census tract, it's over 95%. Not owner lived in, it's rental. It was the largest neighborhood in Minneapolis. 15 years ago, it was cut into 4 sub-neighborhoods. And so North Phillips, Ventura Village is gentrifying, redeveloping very quickly. About 18,000 people lived in this piece. About 1/3 are kids, maybe 1/4 are seniors. It was the home of the largest urban Indian population. Since 1990, it's down by more than 70% because of all the opportunity in the reservation and so forth, and other people groups moving in. The native people moved out. Last time I checked, there were over 400 nonprofit organizations, non-church nonprofits headquartered in this neighborhood. But starting in the 50s, federal, state, local policy was to keep the poor people, keep the brown people in the core city. And so all the human services were put, all of the welfare departments and all of the group homes and halfway houses and treatment centers and all that stuff were all stuck in the core city. And the idea was, well, poor people don't have cars, so we'll put them down there where they can all be together. We'll keep the problems out of the suburbs, and we will we'll confine it to there, and they can walk or they can take buses and get their groceries and so on. And that was by design. And so it's like moving the fuel rods together on a, and we'll put there and in North Minneapolis, we'll put the housing projects and so on. We think there's over 150 different language groups. Most are unreached. Most of the people are unreached by the gospel. Oops, this needs to be changed. I'm sorry, this is old. It's about 1.1 million immigrants and their families in the Twin Cities now. 1.1. That's unfathomable. Individual people, yeah. The immigrants and their families.
Are they even included in the census?
Well, John Mayer's, our friend John Mayer's numbers, which you got like the first day of class, you got a sheet with all the different people groups. His numbers are substantially higher, but he stands by his numbers and he researches them exquisitely. Okay, so let's say you're here as an undocumented person, and you are, and somebody comes to your door and says, "Hi, I'm from the government. Can you tell me your name and you know where you're from, and do you have citizenship, and do you and what are your children's name, and where do you work? Who's your employer?" Do you think you're going to get a lot of people to answer the door and give you the straight answer? Maybe you're of a culture where polygamy. We've got a couple really big cultural groups in the Twin Cities that regularly practice polygamy, and which are primarily the Hmong and the Somalis. And typically a guy will support one family and the others are on welfare. But he doesn't report that he gives some support to that family or that he's actually married to them, because he's not legally married to them. He's kind of married in their culture to them. So the census misses quite a few people, in my opinion. So this is low too. I'm sorry, I should have updated. This is over 200,000 in the metro. And we think if we count the University of Minnesota, probably somebody from every country on earth lives within a 3-mile radius of our door. Think of that. And each group is going to need an individual study and plan and ministry if we're going to reach them. Some of the kids that grew up here. So now in 1880, okay, so here's Portland Avenue, here's Park Avenue, and here's Chicago Avenue. The original vision was Park were for the really rich people in the days before the personal income tax. These are the Washburns and the Daytons and so forth. And then Portland and Chicago, where the hospitals are now, those are upper middle class. Nice big, 5-bedroom, 6-bedroom, 3-story houses, 2-story houses. And then in between were Oakland and Columbus. And that's where the help lived. And so those are little tiny houses, but that's where the help lived. So as we go down Portland, we'll notice there's these houses like this one. Now this is very flat roofed, so this is probably 1870s, maybe even 1860s. The closer we get to 1900, the roofs get steeper and steeper pitch, till finally it's a 60-degree pitch. And these houses, there's all this land, but they build them on 25-foot lots. This house used to be straight across the street from us. And this kind of bric-a-brac and saw cuts and so forth, gingerbread, this is indicative of 1870. You see a lot of this in like Dubuque and old neighborhoods of Chicago and so forth. These houses are right on top of each other. Why would they do that? Because it was a walking city. Everybody walked to work, so you built things close. These are on our side of the street. Notice the saw cut detail. This is just a little later, probably 1880s. This gets a little closer to 1900. This house used to be across the street. It was a huge double house built by a father and a son, and it had 3 floors plus, and it leaked everywhere, and he had buckets everywhere, and it had to be torn down. It was completely shot. We should have bought that land. But there are other nice houses like this. These are anchors to the neighborhood. That was on Portland. But then we get onto Park Avenue. It's a little different scale. This American Swedish Institute. You notice you got a tower and you got a place for Rapunzel to let down her hair. All glass solarium, all stone. And this is the same Richardsonian, round arches and steeply pitched roof, deeply put windows. Same kind of style as our building, but this is the last part of it. It's called the Chateau style. And this is like it looks like a Disneyland castle, and it looks like the Landmark Center in St. Paul. That's the same style. Very rare in the Twin Cities. I only know of the 2, of the Landmark Center and this mansion. Other mansions, there's a brick mansion. This is the headquarters of the Ebenezer Society, and this is a colonial built out of the cheap rustic Platteville limestone. That's a funeral home. This now was an Indian nursing home, and I don't know if anybody's got that yet, and this is also Richardsonian. And that's St. Paul's. Originally that was First Presbyterian, built in 1888. And it had a steeple, which was taken off by the great tornado of 1904. Had stained glass windows, which were broken out in the 50s, unfortunately. This is what it looked like after it was built. And notice there's their hitching rails all along here. Notice you've got a gas light here. Got a little tiny tree out in front. You can look at that later on if you want. The fire plug is still in the same place, the water fire hydrant. And then came the great tornado. Now this is taken from that back in that corner. And the entire steeple, which was never rebuilt, 75 feet of steeple, 54 feet of tower, and the north transept, and this entire north side was completely crushed. 1904, August 20th, 1904. I was very young then. Okay, so this is what it looked like after it was rebuilt. No tower. This is a 1909 postcard printed in Germany, but you can see the pretty stained glass. See, that broke this off here, broke off the chimney, broke off this transept, broke off this tower. Now, how long there were no motors. Right at 1904, there were a lot of stonemasons out of work because they just invented how to pour concrete and how to make concrete blocks. The damage happened on the 20th of August. How long do you think it took them to rebuild it? You are the only person in 30 years that has ever gotten it right. It was rededicated at Thanksgiving. Think of that. All those stones fitted, mortared. Unbelievable. Buckets, pulleys, lots of people. Now, in 1890, 60,000 Minneapolis residents were new immigrants, which was 37%. We're not quite up to that number yet. Now, in 1890, this Park Avenue neighborhood was growing really nicely, and it was where the fancy people lived, and all of a sudden there was a technological change that blew everything up, and it was the beginning of the death knell for this neighborhood. Anybody guess what the technology in 1890 was that changed everything? Well, electricity helped cause it, yeah. Nope. Automobile, nope. Telephone, nope. The coming of the streetcar. The first ones were horse-drawn in 1875, and as they began to expand, they came down, and all of a sudden, these electric streetcars were built all over the place. And so in the late 1880s, you see these routes going off of Hennepin here and going off and towards the lakes, and then as we go by 1905, we see all of a sudden all the way up into these whole areas above Lake of the Isles, along Lake Calhoun, up here in the Kenwood area and so forth. This is a picture. Robert Kohler was the first executive of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. This is a rainy evening on Hennepin Avenue, 1902. This is the year my dad was born. And you can see the streetcar winking at you there in the dark. You can wink back if you want. Anyway, but when all this happened, when all of these were built and all of a sudden you could be downtown, you didn't have to be within walking distance anymore. And so they didn't know how big Minneapolis was going to be. It quadrupled in size in the 1890s. 1 decade, quadrupled. And so where these fancy people had lived here, all of a sudden they moved over here. Now, it also was a change because electricity happened, steam heat happened, and they didn't want drafty old stone buildings and old-fashioned looking buildings. So much stuff was torn down because nobody wants those old-fashioned buildings. They wanted new houses, and the new houses look like this. And those houses are probably worth $1.5 million. They look out on the lake, and day before air conditioning, you could have nice breeze going across the ridge there. Notice you've got a place for the help to live up there. This is 3 stories here, and probably none of us know anybody who has enough money to live in one of those places. But that's downtown, and they could hop on the streetcar and they could be downtown in just a little bit of time, and the family could be out there and go swimming and so forth. And so So the movement was out of this small area where the rich people were supposed to live, just along this little area, and instead this whole area, this is suburban sprawl, this whole area became the place where the nice people lived, and they still do. So after World War I, those big stone houses became rooming houses, maybe, 30 single guys each living in their own room, sharing a bathroom down the hall, and maybe no electricity or maybe really badly put in electricity. And so after World War II, they were torn down for these lovely ticky-tacky non-profit boxes, which now the land under them is probably worth more than the buildings. So gradually they're being torn out. St. Mary's bought a bunch of the land up. We talked about that on the tour. Mount Sinai Hospital had to be built because the Jewish doctors weren't allowed to practice. And this map is the only one that's available, but at that point the blue stuff was done and the red stuff was going to be done. And now all the red and blue stuff has been renewed. So because of all of those policies, and because of the technology and the wealthy people moving out, poorer people moving in, and then all of the banks and their redlining and the federal, state, and local policies, all of that kept poverty in the core city. And then gradually, 1980s, 1990s, and so on, we began spreading people out through Section 8 and other ways so that all the poverty wasn't crunched in. So that's how the neighborhood went, how it was created, why there's a city here. I know I just made you drink from a fire hose again, but all these factors, transportation, food, money in, money out, railroads coming, railroads dying, all these things have had a cost in human, and they have created people moving in, people moving out, real estate prices going up, real estate prices going down. Thousands of factors that all make a difference as to who lives here and what kind of ministry they need. Whether these are people right off the boat, whether these are people that have been here for a while. When I first came here in '88, I believe the number was 70% of the people living in this neighborhood at any given address had lived at that address less than 6 months. Very highly fluid, high poverty, unemployed, chaotic, drug dealing poor. And it got worse, and then gradually it's gotten better. And so all these things have to be taken into account as you look at who is there, what kind of ministry do they need. Somebody that just is here and doesn't speak any English and doesn't have any idea what they're going to do needs a whole lot of different ministry than somebody that's have lived in the city for 30 years. Or somebody that's got a doctorate and wants to live in the city because in their country, living in the city is where the cool people live. So there's a lot of people settling in here. So anyway, we will be...
What was the major factor that has helped it get it to where it is now from 19?
Here, what changed things since 1990? A change in law enforcement for a while, a lot of pressure from a lot of people in the Ventura Village. I don't want to say the village people because then we got to do YMCA. Ventura Village people worked hard, worked with a lot of nonprofits. There have been well over 100 well-run nonprofits that have come in here and created housing and created opportunity, have rehabbed housing, buy the housing and keep it affordable. Now, whether that creates an artificial poverty zone, much like the housing projects of the 40s and 50s and 60s, remains to be seen, how this is going to all turn out. But so far, giving people decent housing, working homeless people into housing and counseling and so forth, with a lot of work and a lot of work to stabilize these folks, most people don't want to live homelessly. Most people don't want to live in dire poverty. Most people, hardly anybody grew up when they were a third grader and said, I want to become a drug dealer and spend most of my adult life in a prison. This is true. My wife is a teacher, but I've also heard this from several different sources. Across the country, they take aptitude tests and tests as to how a kid is doing in third grade. And depending upon the number of kids that don't learn to read or score low on these tests in third grade, they plan the prisons for 20 years later.
Who's they, like the?
Federal government, federal and state governments. Okay, now, next week, you're going to bring in a report. I shortened the reports. Let's try for about 15 minutes. How many groups do we have that are going out? Any idea? As far as the people that are we doing groups of twosies or threesies or? I think so. This is the individual encounter where you're supposed to go out and spend a couple hours just bopping around the neighborhood. And did you